The wind swept across the Dakota plains like a memory that refused to die, carrying dust and the faint cry of a mourning dove through the dry grass. The ranch house stood alone on the ridge, its shutters clattering with each passing gust, and on the porch sat the man they once called Captain Ward, though now no one called him anything at all. He had not spoken a word since the war ended 2 years ago, since the cannon fire swallowed his voice somewhere between smoke and thunder. Some said the wound to his throat had taken it. Others whispered the silence was his choice. Either way, it hung around him like a shadow too loyal to leave. His hands were strong still, broad and steady as he whittled the edge of a broken fence post, the rhythm sharp against the emptiness of his land. Then, far down the trail, a wagon appeared. A small shape at first, shimmering in the afternoon heat, drawing closer until the sunlight caught the glint of a bonnet and the curve of a pale parasol tied to its side. The driver halted the team near the porch, cleared his throat, and called out, "Mail-order bride from Missouri, name's Clara Hale." Ward didn't move, didn't answer. The driver frowned, looked between them, then shrugged and tipped his hat. "Contract says she's yours till harvest. She's quiet," they said. "Suits you." With that, he turned his wagon and rode off, leaving the woman standing in the dust with her small trunk and the wind lifting the hem of her dress. She was younger than Ward expected. Mid-20s, maybe, her face pale from travel, but her eyes steady. "Mr. Ward," she said softly, and though he didn't respond, something in the way her voice trembled seemed to fill the silence he lived in. She looked around, the faded corral, the half-mended gate, the lonely oak swaying near the barn, and then met his gaze again. "I'll make myself useful," she murmured. Ward stood, nodding once, slow, and motioned toward the house. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and horses. The table held 2 plates, both clean, but only one had ever been used. Clara set down her trunk by the hearth, studying the place with quiet care. "You live alone?" she asked, then caught herself, realizing the foolishness of the question. Of course he did. The sound of her own voice embarrassed her. She busied herself opening shutters, sweeping dust from the counter, doing anything to fill the unbearable quiet between them. When she passed by his chair, she saw his eyes flicker to her wedding band, the simple silver ring she'd put on herself that morning because no one else had done it. He noticed things, she realized. He just didn't speak them. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the hills, Ward set a kettle on the stove and poured her a cup of tea, his movements deliberate, precise. When she reached to take it, his calloused fingers brushed hers, and for the first time in years, something moved across his face, an emotion small but human. Gratitude. He tapped his chest once, then gestured to her. "You're welcome?" she guessed softly. He hesitated, then nodded. It was enough. As the night grew colder, she sat near the fire, and he sat across from her, sharpening his knife in silence. The flames danced between them, throwing their shadows on the wall. 2 strangers bound not by vows or desire, but by the weight of what they'd both lost. Outside, coyotes howled across the valley. Inside, the only sound was the scrape of steel against stone, and beneath it, a silence that wasn't empty at all. It was waiting. By morning, frost rimmed the window glass, and the plains lay still, the first light stretching thin and silver over the hills. Clara woke before dawn, her breath a pale cloud in the cold cabin air, and found Ward already outside by the corral, moving with the quiet strength of a man who had long learned to talk to the world through work alone. His boots left tracks in the half-frozen mud, his shoulders bent beneath a coat gone soft from years of weather, and each motion, saddling the mare, fixing the gait, pouring grain, was so steady it almost felt like prayer. She stepped out onto the porch, her shawl tight around her shoulders, and said softly, "You don't sleep much, do you?" He paused, looked at her, then shook his head once. When he turned back to the mare, she thought she saw his jaw tighten, as if he wanted to answer and couldn't. She came closer, careful not to spook either of them, and reached for the pail beside him. "I can help," she offered. He watched her take it, surprise flickering across his face before he stepped aside. The pail was heavier than she expected. She stumbled a little, and his hand shot out, catching her elbow before she fell. His grip was firm, grounding. For a heartbeat they stood like that, their breath mingling in the cold air, the unspoken hum of something fragile between them. Then she straightened, nodding. "Thank you," she said, and though he didn't speak, he lifted a hand slightly, as if the gesture meant you're safe here. That small motion stayed with her all morning. She worked through the day, hauling water, sweeping, baking cornbread with what little flour she found in the tin. And though Ward said nothing, she could feel his eyes following her, not in judgment but in curiosity, as if he'd forgotten how to share a home and was relearning by watching her do it. When she accidentally burned the first loaf, the smell filling the cabin with smoke. She waved the pan in a panic, coughing, and he startled, then chuckled. A low sound, like a rumble, caught halfway in his chest. She froze, stunned. He hadn't made a sound since she'd arrived. He met her gaze, embarrassed, and quickly looked away, the hint of a smile ghosting across his face. She wanted to say something light, something to honor the tiny miracle of that moment, but instead she just laughed too, softly, and the air between them changed. That night, after supper, she found an old Bible on the shelf, its leather cover cracked, and sat by the fire, turning its pages. He watched from across the room, mending a saddle strap. "You read this?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, then nodded once, tapping the word Psalms with the tip of his finger. She smiled faintly. "The songs without music," she said. "I used to think they sounded lonely. Now I think they sound brave." His hands slowed their work, and when he looked up at her, something gentle had returned to his eyes, like a man remembering warmth after too long in cold. As the fire dimmed and the room grew quiet, she spoke again, barely above a whisper. "If you ever want to say anything at all, I'll listen." He looked down, thumb tracing the scar along his throat, then lifted his eyes to her, and though no words came, the way he nodded once, slow and sure, told her everything. It wasn't that he couldn't speak. It was that he hadn't been heard. 3 days passed beneath a veil of snow and silence. The wind howled against the cabin walls like something alive, and the roof creaked as if carrying the weight of ghosts. Clara moved quietly through the house, her hands red from cold water, her breath fogging as she worked to keep the fire burning. Ward spent most daylight hours outside, chopping wood or tending to the livestock, but each night he lingered a little longer inside, as if learning to belong again. One afternoon, while sweeping near the doorway, she heard him humming, barely audible, a low, broken tune that faltered halfway through. She turned and froze. His back was to her, his head bowed as he mended a saddle strap, unaware that the sound had escaped him. It was rough and unsteady, like a bird trying to remember how to fly. When he noticed her watching, he stopped instantly, his hands stiff. She smiled gently. "That was a hymn, wasn't it?" He didn't answer, but the way his shoulders eased told her she was right. "My mother used to sing it," she added softly. "Said it was for soldiers who came home with quiet hearts." His eyes lifted at that, meeting hers for the briefest moment before he looked away. Later, while setting supper on the table, she saw him studying her hands, raw and nicked from work. Without a word, he rose, fetched a small tin of salve from the shelf, and placed it beside her plate. The gesture was so unexpected it nearly broke her. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then traced a finger through the dust on the table's edge and wrote 3 shaky letters, CLA. She blinked. He'd written her name halfway, then stopped, embarrassed, rubbing it out before she could respond. Her throat tightened. "Say it," she urged softly, voice trembling. "Just once." He froze, the air between them heavy, his chest rising like a man about to face a storm. Then, almost too quiet to hear, the sound came, rasped, broken, but real. "Clara." The syllables were torn and rough, but to her they were the sweetest thing the plains had ever carried. Her eyes filled instantly, and she reached across the table, covering his scarred hand with hers. "That's my name," she whispered, smiling through tears. He looked down at their joined hands, something like disbelief softening his features. The fire cracked behind them, the storm outside howling its grief. But inside, a different sound took root. A man's first word reborn, a woman's name turned into prayer. That night, she lay awake in the loft, listening to the wind and replaying that moment until it felt like a promise. She didn't know yet what war had taken from him, but she was certain of one thing. Whatever it was, it hadn't taken his soul. It had only buried it under silence, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it back out. The snow eased 2 mornings later, leaving the world silver and still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Clara stepped outside to hang laundry between the posts, her skirts whipping in the cold air, the smell of pine and smoke wrapping around her like memory. Ward was near the corral, hammering a board back into place, his breath misting in quiet bursts. She caught herself watching him again, the way his sleeves rolled up past his elbows, the way his silence didn't feel empty anymore, but deliberate, like a man rebuilding from the inside out. When the line snapped under the weight of wet cloth, she stumbled, the basket tipping, and before she could catch it, he was already there. He steadied her arm and reached for the fallen sheets, his hands brushing hers in the cold. She laughed softly. "You don't have to keep saving me." His gaze lifted. For the first time, she saw the faintest smile tug at the corner of his mouth. He pointed to his throat, then to her, then tapped his chest. She frowned in confusion until he gestured again, slower this time, his finger tracing the air. "You speak enough for both of us." She blinked, warmth flooding her face. "Then I'll keep doing it," she whispered, "until you want to again." Later that day, as she cooked by the fire, she hummed the hymn he'd murmured days before. The tune drifted softly through the cabin, fragile but alive. He stopped working mid-step, his head tilting toward her like a man hearing sunlight. She didn't notice him standing in the doorway, hands motionless, eyes fixed on her as if afraid to break the moment. When she finished, the silence that followed was heavier than the song had been. He crossed to the table, placed his palm flat beside her, and tapped once. 2 slow beats, then 1. It took her a second to realize it was rhythm, a reply. A heartbeat made audible. She met his eyes, and something passed between them that neither could name. That evening, they shared supper quietly, steam rising between them as snow fell beyond the window. She noticed how his movements had softened, how he waited for her to sit first, how he poured her tea before his own. When she thanked him, he touched his chest again, nodding. That night, before she climbed to the loft, she turned at the stairs. "You said my name once," she said gently. "Next time maybe yours?" He looked up, surprised, then hesitated before drawing a slow breath. "Ward," he rasped. It was almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like thunder. Her lips parted in wonder, and he held her gaze, that small word, the one that had been buried with his voice, rising now like light from a wound. "Good night, Ward," she said, smiling softly. And though he didn't answer, the way he looked at her said everything the world had forgotten how to hear. The thaw came slow, turning the snow to rivers that cut through the valley like veins of silver, and with it came a letter from town. Clara found it wedged under the gate post one morning, the paper damp, the seal broken. She wiped it dry against her skirt and brought it to Ward, who sat sharpening a blade near the porch steps. When he saw the handwriting, his body went still. He took the envelope carefully, his thumb grazing the familiar scrawl of a name he hadn't seen in years. Samuel Ward, War Office. His jaw tightened, and he rose, walking to the fence, staring out at the hills. Clara followed, uncertain. "Is it bad news?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. Instead, he unfolded the paper, eyes scanning each line with the stillness of a man reading his own ghost. The wind caught the edge, snapping it once before he crushed the letter in his hand and shoved it into his coat pocket. Clara waited, her breath caught in the space between them. "Was it from someone you knew?" she asked gently. He turned, his expression unreadable, then nodded once and pointed towards the barn. She followed him without another word. Inside, the air smelled of hay and old leather. He moved to a shelf, pulled down a small wooden box, and opened it. Inside lay medals dulled by dust, a ribbon, a photograph of men in uniform, one with eyes like his but younger, unbroken. He pointed to the man beside him in the picture, then pressed his hand to his chest. "Brother." Her heart sank. "He didn't make it home?" Ward's silence was the answer. She knelt beside him, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry." He shook his head, eyes dark but steady, and took the crushed letter from his pocket, handing it to her. She hesitated, then unfolded it. The ink had bled from moisture, but the words were clear enough. To the family of Captain Samuel Ward. "We regret to inform you that your brother's remains were identified last month near the battlefield at Cold Creek. Enclosed is the Medal of Valor earned in his final service." Clara's throat tightened. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw tears in his eyes, silent, unfallen, but there all the same. He took the medal from her hand and closed it in his fist. Then, without warning, he struck the post beside them, the sound echoing through the barn like thunder. "Ward!" she cried, grabbing his arm. He froze, trembling, breath heaving, and when he finally looked at her, the fury in his face had melted into grief. She reached up, cupping his jaw, her thumb brushing the scar along his throat. "You don't have to speak," she whispered. "I can hear you anyway." The moment stretched, raw and trembling, until his breath steadied. He stepped back, turned toward the light spilling through the cracks, and for the first time, his lips moved. Not words, but a prayer, mouthed soundlessly to the sky. Clara stood behind him, watching as his shoulders eased, and in that silence, she understood. His voice wasn't gone. It had just found a new way to be heard. The days that followed carried a strange gentleness, as if the mountain itself had decided to give them both a truce. The air warmed, and the valley began to stir again, the creek whispering under the thaw, birds returning to the fence posts, life crawling back into places that had forgotten it. Clara worked the small garden patch behind the cabin, while Ward mended the roof, both of them moving in an unspoken rhythm that no vow or ceremony could have created. She'd begun to hum again while she worked, that same broken hymn from before, and sometimes he'd stop hammering mid-strike, listening until she caught him doing it. Then he'd shake his head with mock annoyance, and she'd smile like it was a victory. One afternoon, she slipped on the thawing ground while carrying a basket of eggs. She fell hard into the mud, gasping as yolk splattered across her dress. For a heartbeat, she just sat there, stunned, before the absurdity of it hit her. She started laughing. Real, breathless laughter that bent her forward until tears rolled down her cheeks. Ward came running from the porch, eyes wide, ready for danger, only to stop dead when he saw her rolling in mud and laughter. She looked up at him, trying to speak between breaths. You should have seen your face." He stood there, confused. Then something remarkable happened. He smiled. A small, hesitant twitch at first, then a real grin that reached his eyes. Clara froze, mid-laugh, because it was the first time she'd ever seen it. And then he laughed too, a low, hoarse sound, half cough, half joy, like a rusted door swinging open for the first time in years. She gasped. "You can laugh," he nodded, still catching his breath, his eyes crinkling in a way that made him look 10 years younger. She wiped mud from her face, grinning through her embarrassment. "Guess we both found something we forgot," she said softly. That evening, the house felt lighter somehow. Ward had washed the mud from her apron in the creek without being asked and set it by the fire to dry. When she came downstairs after changing, she found a single cup of coffee waiting on the table beside a rough scrap of paper. In his blocky handwriting it read, "Laughter sounds better than wind." She pressed the note to her chest, tears threatening again. But this time they were warm. When Ward returned from stabling the horses, she looked at him and whispered, "Then I'll make sure you never forget that sound again." He didn't speak, but the way he looked at her said he believed her, and when the wind rose again outside, it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like something learning to breathe. That night the wind changed, sharp and dry, carrying the scent of smoke long before either of them saw the glow. Clara woke first to the faint crackle beyond the window, and by the time she reached the door, the ridge was already painted in orange light. The barn had caught fire. She shouted his name before remembering he couldn't answer. Ward was already halfway out the door, pulling on his coat as he ran into the night. The air burned against her lungs as she followed, the sound of horses screaming splitting the quiet valley. Flames licked through the roof, the heat fierce and wild. Ward grabbed a bucket and ran for the well, his movements fast and sure, but the fire moved faster. Clara's voice cut through the smoke. "Ward, the chest." He turned, realizing she was pointing toward the far stall where his wooden box, the one holding his brother's photograph and medals, sat beside the feed barrels. He hesitated, torn between safety and memory. Then, without a word, he plunged inside. "Ward!" she screamed, but the smoke swallowed his name. The roof groaned overhead as he disappeared into the blaze. Seconds felt like hours until his shadow stumbled through the doorway, coughing, clutching the charred box against his chest. He collapsed to his knees, the box tumbling into the dirt. Clara ran to him, pulling her shawl over his mouth and pressing her hands to his face. "Ward, look at me." His eyes fluttered open, and she saw fear there, not for himself, but for her. "You're bleeding," she whispered, seeing the cut above his brow. He shook his head, pointing to her sleeve where embers had caught. She swatted them out, trembling, and only then realized his lips were moving. No sound came at first, just the effort, the strain of a voice long locked away. She held her breath, staring at him, and then, broken but clear, she heard it. "Clara." Her eyes filled. "I'm here," she said. He blinked, breath ragged, and rasped again, stronger this time. "Run!" She shook her head fiercely. "Not without you." He tried to push her back, but she didn't move. Instead, she grabbed the bucket from his hand and threw another wave of water over the doorway, the two of them side by side until the flames hissed low enough to retreat. When the fire finally died, the barn stood half broken, but still standing. Clara slumped beside him in the dirt, coughing. He looked at her, voice trembling as if every word tore through years of silence. "You could have died." She smiled weakly. "So could you." For a long time they just sat there, the world around them glowing with ember light, until she reached out and touched his cheek. "You spoke," she whispered, her voice breaking. He swallowed hard, his eyes wet. "Guess I had to." "Why now?" she asked softly. He took her hand, his thumb brushing the mud on her skin. "Because losing you would have been worse than silence." And when she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, the fire behind them flickered low, leaving nothing but the sound of two hearts, one rediscovering words, the other teaching him what they were for. The fire left a scar across the land, but something else bloomed in its wake. A stillness filled with meaning. In the mornings, smoke still curled from the blackened barn beams, but laughter began to rise from the porch again, small and hesitant like new spring grass. Ward's voice, though cracked and halting, began to return in pieces. He tried words the way a child tests steps, slow, careful, trembling with effort. "Salt," he said one afternoon at breakfast, pointing to the tin. Clara passed it with a soft smile. "Salt," she repeated, letting the word linger. He nodded, repeating it under his breath like a prayer. "Fence," he murmured a few days later, lifting his hammer. "Fence," she echoed. "Good," she whispered. Each word was a victory, and each one she treated like sacred ground. At first he could barely string two together. But she never hurried him, never looked away when he failed. "You don't need to be perfect," she said once when he faltered, his throat tightening with frustration. "You just need to be brave." He looked at her then, and something inside him finally unclenched. That evening they stood outside, watching a pale sunset bleed into the horizon. The wind moved gently through the grass, and from the valley below came the faint laughter of travelers passing along the old road. For the first time, Ward didn't look away. He turned to Clara and whispered, "Sound beautiful." She smiled through tears. "It is." "You," he added after a pause, her heart stilled. "Me?" He nodded, and though the word was rough, it carried the truth his silence had never been able to say. She took his hand and placed it against her chest. "Then listen," she said softly. "Because it's beating for both of us now." He blinked, his thumb brushing the edge of her collarbone, his breath uneven, the firelight from the cabin window touching his face like grace. When she stepped back, she said gently, "I think the land is starting to heal because you are." That night, long after she fell asleep, he sat by the fire whispering words into the quiet, small, broken, tender things like home, safe, and finally her name again, but this time it came out whole. Clara. The valley heard it. The wind seemed to pause, as if honoring the sound that had once been lost to war but had now found its way back through love. By late spring, word had spread that Captain Ward, the mute rancher from the hills, had found his voice again. It began as a whisper in town, carried by the mail rider who claimed he'd heard him say, "Thank you," while signing for seed grain. Most didn't believe it. But one afternoon, when Clara and Ward rode into town to sell pelts, the truth came to life. The blacksmith was arguing with a trader over a shipment when Ward stepped in, quiet but steady, and said, "He's right. You shorted him 2 hides." The sound cut through the square like a gunshot. Everyone stopped. The trader blinked, the blacksmith froze mid-sentence, and the sheriff standing on the porch of the general store lowered his pipe. It had been years since anyone had heard that voice, low, rough, but strong enough to silence the street. Clara stood beside him, heart thudding, watching the disbelief melt into awe on every face. "Captain Ward," the sheriff said, stepping forward with a slow grin, "didn't think I'd ever hear you again." Ward gave a small nod, tipping his hat, then turned to Clara, as if to make sure she was real and not some miracle he'd imagined. On the way back home, she said softly, "How did it feel?" He took a long moment before answering. "Loud," he said, and then, after a pause, "Right." She laughed quietly. "You're not afraid anymore?" He looked at her, the reins loose in his hand, eyes bright in the fading sun. "Not of sound," he said. "Not of silence either." That night, they sat on the porch watching the stars slide above the black ridge. The world felt wider now, the silence no longer a cage but a resting place between words. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "You know," she whispered, "you don't have to fill the air with talking. I already hear you." He smiled faintly. "How?" "The way you look at me when I speak," she said. "The way you listen like it matters." He turned, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "It does." Her eyes shimmered in the lantern glow. "Then tell me something that matters most." He hesitated, gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, it was barely more than a breath. "Stay." Her throat caught. The word was soft, but carried everything, the years of silence, the pain, the healing. She reached up, cupping his face. "I was never leaving," she whispered. He kissed her hand, his eyes closing like a man who'd just heard music after decades of quiet. And as the wind moved through the valley, even the night seemed to listen. As if the stars themselves understood what it meant for a man who'd lost his voice to finally find the one word worth saying. Summer arrived gentle and golden, washing the valley in light so soft it seemed to forgive everything that had ever hurt there. The fields shimmered with tall grass, the air smelled of wild sage, and Ward's cabin no longer looked like a soldier's refuge. It looked like a home. Clara was in the garden that morning, her hands deep in soil, when Ward came from the barn carrying something wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table and unfolded it to reveal a small, carved wooden plaque. She brushed the dust from it and froze. Burned into the wood, in uneven letters, were 2 words. "Our home." Her breath caught as she looked up at him. He shrugged, almost shy. "Didn't know what else to call it," he said, his voice low but clear. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken in front of her since the war. She reached out, tracing the letters with trembling fingers. "It's perfect." They hung it over the doorway together that afternoon, and when she stepped back to look at it, tears glimmered in her eyes. The sun caught his hair, the wind lifting the hem of her dress, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. That night, as dusk deepened and the first stars came out, Ward sat on the porch with his guitar, the one he hadn't touched since before his voice broke. His fingers moved slowly, searching for old chords, and when Clara came to sit beside him, he started to hum, just barely, the same hymn she had sung that winter. She joined in quietly, her voice filling the gaps his couldn't reach. The 2 melodies, his rough and hers soft, wove together like thread through a wound. When the song ended, she whispered, "You remember the first word you said to me?" He smiled faintly. Your name. And the last one you want to keep saying? He looked at her then, the firelight reflecting in his eyes, and answered without hesitation. Stay. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as the crickets began to sing. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the echo rolled across the valley like a benediction. For the first time in years, Ward didn't flinch at the sound. He listened, his hand tightening gently around hers. The man who once lost his voice to war had found it again in love. Not through noise, but through the quiet courage of being heard. And as the night wrapped around them, the cabin's porch light flickered like a steady heart, whispering to the dark that sometimes the loudest word of all is the one that stays. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic frontier tales from Echoes of the West, where courage meets tenderness and love learns to speak again. Tell us in the comments below, would you have waited for someone who'd forgotten how to say your name?